My goal today is to put everything together that you've heard and to put it in a context that you can bring it back to your communities and actually utilize that information and bring it into a focus for your next programs and for your teams. And I think I want to start with the very bottom line is that fact, bottom line is criminal justice professionals and allied stakeholders who interact with victims and witnesses face numerous hurdles combating witness intimidation. And I need us to understand the fact that witness intimidation is increasing nationally. It is going across the boards. It is affecting major cities. It is a point that is, as you know, it's going on in the administration, a big focus. It's a focus of the Department of Justice community-oriented policing services and National Institute of Justice and a broader criminal justice process. And as I'm saying all this, I realize that I did not take a moment to introduce myself. And I'm going to do that with the next slide here, with the fact that I have been actually working in the field of victim services for over 35 years. I've lived in major cities, New York, New Jersey, Albuquerque, New Mexico. I somehow got into a lot of the news when I moved around, in Washington, D.C. now, and we'll be moving to New Orleans shortly. As you may have noticed in my titles, I'm just recently retired from ATF, and I have seen major crimes, and this is exactly where we've seen a major form of intimidation, tampering with witnesses. It has actually derailed over 30% of criminal cases involving shootings, and over 90% of documented homicide cases were affected by intimidation. These cases did not go to trial. These cases did not get the justice that they were needed. And that's where we've seen a large part of this. Prior to coming into government, prior to working with ATF, I was a former director of sexual assault programs and domestic violence programs throughout the country, as I said, in New York and New Jersey and New Mexico. I have experience working with violence against women and working with major crimes, as well as working on both sides of law enforcement. And I have been able to bridge a gap between the social services and the law enforcement, and having them understand the needs from both sides. So I will be presenting to you a perspective from a social service perspective, but an understanding of where law enforcement does play a major role and can actually make some changes with regard to witness intimidation and victim intimidation. Please feel free to ask any questions as I'm going along. I will try and get through this quickly, but with a lot of information. I know it's been a very long day. And one of the things I also want to make sure is I know that we're going to be repeating some things. I know each of us do, because they bring it up in different perspectives, but I also know as adults, we all need to hear things a couple of times and in different contexts. So I do apologize if some things are being repeated from our previous speakers, but I'm hoping that we will hear it in different contexts and it can take it away and use it for your communities. There are two forms of intimidation. One is case specific, as you understand, and as you probably know, is that is where we have a specific victim and law enforcement is dealing with a particular person in a particular case. Community-wide intimidation tends to create an environment of fear within the community. We see this a lot in gang-ridden communities. Again, back to our inner cities, places like Baltimore have seen high crimes of gang violence and whole communities fearing and refusing to come forward to talk to law enforcement and prosecution. Those are some of the times that we see them not going forward as well, but also whole communities feeling intimidated and not wanting to, as we would say, rock the boat. Or the basic line that a lot of time we'll hear is, don't be a snitch. One of the things is that with witness intimidation, it's defined by anything, and that means anything done with the intent or purpose to prevent or alter a witness's testimony. That comes down to anything of physical, emotional, financial threats or intimidation or bribes or family, following through with families, intimidating them. We see that throughout, especially when we have people from other communities, other countries, who may be undocumented, and they fear that they cannot go forward to law enforcement because they would either be deported or family would be killed back home. We see that in whole communities where people are afraid that their family would be threatened or killed because of the fact that they come forward. So we see that in a lot of different ways. In addition, the overt threats of any kind of violence or other harm. It includes implied threats, including emotional manipulation. We see that a lot of times when we talk about domestic violence, as we've heard before, but one of the bigger pieces is also in communities, implied threats of holding back funds, holding back resources, letting people know that they're not going to have new things in their community. That is another implied threats that we do see. The effects of judicial process, as you know, it's very clearly when witnesses don't come forward, we're not going to have a case going forward. When witnesses get killed, we don't have a case going forward. The derailment of cases, people not feeling that they can say anything, that cases are going to actually be stopped. And we see that quite often, that we have to dismiss cases, we have to dismiss whole investigations, or continue for years and never being able to solve anything. The derailment of the judicial system is a major factor what happens with intimidation, and that is the intent of the intimidation, is to stop it, is to stop the case going forward at all. We also see the factor of increased distrust of the law enforcement judicial process. And this is important because one of the things that we try and do working with communities, and I know in working in Project Safe Neighborhoods, we're trying to change that process. We're trying to change that cycle. And one of the pieces that we're trying to do with this, with regard to what is intimidation and assisting and providing some resources that we'll be getting into, is to try and change that process. And one of the ways is for people in the community to see that law enforcement, those people in blue, the people who are coming forward to take that information, the prosecutors, that these people are going to be making a change, going to be making a difference, and that they're going to do something different than what the person before them didn't do. The idea of actually doing something with the case and not having it end and not having those criminals continue to disrupt the community will make a change, will stop the process, will change the cycle. And also will change the cycle for a lot of children. And that is a major part that we need to talk about, and I will be talking about in a few moments, is the children who witness this. So as you know, means of intimidation is direct or indirect. Indirect intimidation can be implied, unspoken, hidden, looks behind the scenes, people just holding back things. But direct can be very physical, nonverbal communication threats, emotional manipulation, social media. And that's a big one that we do see quite often. Threats on social media, people's pictures being put out there as snitches, contracts being put out on someone. You know, that is the process that you'll see a lot of direct manipulation. And of course, the community pressure, people from within the community, from within apartment buildings, within the block, pressuring people not to go forward, not to talk, not to respond to law enforcement, people locking themselves behind closed doors. We see that quite often, people not answering the door, not talking with anyone. And as you know, methods of intimidation, as everyone has talked about, is physical violence, verbal, nonverbal, emotional manipulation, as I said, with social media. And as I said, the communal pressures, the community. But one of the things I want to talk about a lot, and I'd like to focus a little bit more on, is the community violence and the exposure to violence between unrelated individuals who may or may not know each other, may be more likely outside of the home. Examples of community violence include riots, sniper attacks, gang wars. We see that a lot in our inner cities, the drive-by shootings, with regard to, again, the gang wars, the bullying, but mostly we're seeing other gangs coming into one community and basically frightening and basically causing other community members not to come forward. No one's talking about the shooter. No one's talking about who shot from the cars, from the street, and killed the 2-year-old child inside the house. Well, we're talking about, workplace assaults, terrorist attacks, torture, bombings. war, ethnic cleansing. And I know this is not going on in our communities, but it's important to know that that is all still part of community violence. And the other piece is ongoing sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. And that can go on in communities or even sometimes in homes, children watching that within their house. And we talked about that domestic violence, but also in the community itself. There is a rampant of one gang forcing, just so we saw in wars, of basically using women as the means to get back at one side or another, and raping and abusing them. And that's what we see sometimes in our gang environments as well. So we need to be aware of how that is being brought into the community. Community intimidation, as we talked about, is public acts of violence. And sometimes they're very, very clear, very overt. We know that they are going on right in front of the children, the community. So it's not that we are wondering where is it coming from or wondering if it's happening at all. But what's clear is the no snitching mindset. And as I said, we've seen this a lot on the social media as a picture is posted saying they're a snitch, and now there is a contract placed on them. And as I said, Richard, please feel free to interrupt any questions that may come up. I have no problem actually addressing any of those that may come up at this time. So some of the things is that, so why does this really happen? Why are we seeing this a lot in the communities? Is that the loyalties to one's gang or to one's own neighborhood can continue. One can feel that they are more loyal to a gang than they are to their own family sometimes. We've had situations where, we had a family involved in a gang, one of the basic motorcycle gangs, and one mother was basically involved with one of the higher ups in the motorcycle gang. Her daughter actually turned and gave evidence against the gang. And what happened was that the mother threw the daughter out of the home, put a contract out on her for snitching and providing law enforcement information against her provider, her financial means. And she felt that her daughter was betraying her and the gang and the funds that were coming in. So instead of protecting her daughter and saying that she was going to protect her and keep her safe, she threw her out and put her out there with a contract on her. So we have this sense of loyalty, the sense of, I have to defend this part and these people over here because they're providing me a means of fundings, a shelter. It's also a sense of the brainwashing in a lot of ways. We see this a lot in jails. We see this a lot with our terrorists. We see this when we have people who have been kidnapped and have been with their kidnappers for a long time. So we do see this kind of mentality taking place. Some of the consequences that we have, the effects, the identification, the best practices addressing is actually increased and continued community violence. So the more we do not respond to it, the more we do not have witnesses coming forward, the more we have this increasing. The more we see that the gang or the abusers or the criminals feel that they can, and they're sort of given that sense of right to continue the violence and to continue manipulating and holding down the community. Witness intimidation, as we talked about, voices are suppressed. People do not come forward. They don't speak out. They don't move forward in creating positive things in the community. They don't come forward not only for law enforcement, but also the enrichment of things that could be there. There's a sense of isolation. People lock themselves behind doors. They don't come out. They don't talk to each other. And we do see immense trauma to the point of PTSD. We talk about PTSD with regard to sexual assault victims, in regard to basically soldiers and wars, but also when people are constantly in a sense of violence, which is the same things that we see with war. You're constantly hearing, you're constantly seeing, you're constantly being terrorized and feared. This is where you're going to move forward with a PTSD effect. You're going to constantly fear that you can't go outside, you can't be with others, you can't talk to people, and you fear that you're going to continuously have that emotional trauma. That is the same things that we see with our soldiers. We're seeing this in our violent communities. So I'm going to do a little quick case study and talk about how what's going on in the communities can can move forward. We can create some changes. And some of the changes will take place and need to take place with a team efforts, which I will be talking about, because that is how, and everybody's talked about that all day today, is that how we need to bring in victim service people, we need to bring in community providers. And I want to talk a little bit about how it has worked and how it has made a difference, and how everything that you've heard today can be utilized in your own communities. So this is actually what Camden, New Jersey looked like back in 2012. This is an actual picture of there, almost a war zone. The community was living in fear. People would not come out of their homes. People would not venture out. When we were working out there at ATF, one of my agents that I worked with told me a story about an elderly gentleman who he met sitting on his stoop in broad daylight. And our agent, who was in plain clothes, just basically walking around, and asked him what's going on and what he sees in the community. The elderly gentleman said, nothing's you can do here is going to make a difference, because nothing can change. And everybody talked about how they are going to stay in their homes, and how mothers would not even let their children come out in daylight, let alone in the dark, to go and play on the streets. So the deterioration of the city was intense. People just never came outside. There was fear. There was apathy from both the residents as well as from the law enforcement, because everyone felt that nothing can make a difference. It just kept continuously decaying and kept going downward. During that time, we saw that in violent communities we saw that in January 1st and March 31st, if you look at the scales here, back in 2012, Camden, New Jersey was rated by the FBI as the most violent community. It's #1 on the top hit parade. It actually was the total homicides and rapes. It outnumbered that of the mean of what was going on in New Jersey as a whole. So the population of 77,665, there was back then, the murder rate was over, as you see down below, the murder rate was over 44, where then started going down in 2013 and 2014. And you started seeing some change from 2012 going down, increasingly numbers going down. This did not happen as a fluke. This did not happen as a one-time event. One of the other things back in 2012 was actually the data of the high school rates and the number of students actually going to high school, graduating high school and going to college. Down from 2012 in Camden high school students, there was just about 49% rate of graduation. Whereas in 2018, the graduation rate went up to 65.9%. Crime declined. Students and youth was actually working. They were actually going to school, and they were staying in school. Several factors were a cause of this. One thing is, the most important thing was actually working a lot with federal and local community law enforcement as well as services. One of the things that took place, one of the major parts, was actually 2012, mostly 2013, the city police department was dissolved. They completely dissolved the city police department, and they set up a Camden County Police Department. What that meant, the county actually had responsibility, and law enforcement changed. How they started moving their work was more community directed. They started working with the community, started developing youth programs. They actually started working with individual persons. Attention to educational systems started being increased. The community at large was now focusing on their needs in there. They were actually talking to each other. And this took both law enforcement, community leaders, as well as federal law enforcement to work together to bring everybody together. There is a community involvement that actually made a rapid change in what's going on. One of the changes also was the police. As I said earlier, there was a lot of apathy prior to 2012. Police response back then took over an hour an hour for a policeman to respond. Part of that was fears, part of that was apathy, part of that was the sense of lack of law enforcement at times because they kept leaving, they kept deteriorating. By 2014, 2015, the response rate went to 4.4 minutes. There was a big difference. So that also showed the community that law enforcement cared. And again, that's the cycle we have to keep showing, is that there is a connection, that there's going to be a connection of what we care about, what's going on there. We all hear those terms from our parents, from our grandparents, from everywhere. You got to basically put your money where your mouth is. You have to basically step forward, and whatever you say, you need to do. That's exactly what we had to show here. And that's exactly what happened in Camden. And that's exactly what we're talking about in working in team efforts and moving forward and changing the communities. One of the pieces is making sure the community feels trust and feels they're going to be heard and feels that what they say is going to make a difference. Without that, we have people feeling that they're going to be stranded and they're by themselves. They're not going to feel safe. If I don't feel that law enforcement's going to help me when they come and threaten me, how can I come forward and give you information? So making the change, meeting the challenge takes a team. And that's the bottom line. No one agency, no one program, no one service can do it by themselves. Law enforcement, prosecutor's office, victim advocates, victim service communities, community services, youth programs, day centers, schools, churches, and community members and leaders. You have to bring them all together. Not one can work on their own. So some of the strategies, joint investigations, that's what took place there. That's what we showed in Camden. We had joint investigations, federal and local working together. One of the things I would always say to people when I work with ATF is that the mantra at ATF is that we work with our communities. We are a team, and that's part of how it operates here. I'm sorry about that. My lights went out. I'm sorry. One of the things that we always see here is the fact that, not one agency, not one law enforcement program can be on their own. They all have to be working together. And sometimes cases will go federal, sometimes they'll go state. ATF has always worked with their local law enforcement, even if they're quote unquote just assisting and getting a case forward. Team development, one of the strategies is developing the team, which I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes. Family justice centers, those communities that have those, that is, and those who don't know what that is where you bring all the resources to one place, one large area, building, room, however, that includes law enforcement, the ability to get a restraining order, ability to apply for disabilities, for Social Security, for SSIs, for anything else that you may need, some insurances and childcare, everything in one community, so that people don't have to be running through whole cities and traveling around and having to expend expenses on mass transportation. And it makes it so that everybody's working together as well, that not one is having to, not everyone understands when someone comes in there for a restraining order, they understand all the pieces of it. You don't have to say the story 7 times, it all is one place. Victim witness assistance programs. It is essential to make sure that you have a victim witness assistance programs working with your law enforcement with regard to witness intimidation, victim intimidation. You can't move somebody forward. You can't take somebody and find them new locations, new services, new housing that without the victim services provided. You can't work on the needs, the emotional, financial, psychological needs that someone has without those pieces there. Education as well. And I'm talking about education of your youth as well as your stakeholders, your members of your team. Training, of course, is involved. Everyone needs to be trained and needs to be unified trained. Community member support. Again, we cannot work in a vacuum. Everyone has to be working together. Collaboration is essential in doing any of these pieces of this. So collaboration, and I'm going to give you a quick little synopsis of what those are: networking, exchanging information for mutual benefit, coordination, exchanging that information again to achieve a common purpose. This is important. Everyone has to be working on a common goal. whatever the goals are, whatever your definitions are, whatever you determine is going to be the goal for your community, for your team, everyone has to have a buy-in into it. Cooperation, you all have to be working to achieve the common purpose and basically moving and altering the actions that's going on right there to achieve it. So you have to work together. Nobody can work on their own, and that means sharing your resources. That's collaboration and enhancement of capacity. No one should be working in silence. Everyone needs to be sharing that information. There's always been, a long time ago, nonprofits had a sense that they're not going to share information with another nonprofit in their community because they're going to get those fundings and grants. We need to be working together. All of those nonprofits, law enforcement services need to work together and share those funds, but also share the resources so that they can grow and better the community. So one of the things is in community advocacy, agencies informally exchange information. You hire staff to work specifically to do this outreach, to work with the community members. You have agencies that have advocates and participate cross trainings. Cross training is essential. One of the things that's vital is actually making sure law enforcement and victim services both have that knowledge. I agree with our previous speakers when we say no, advocates are not going to be the ones going out there on their own, and they should not be doing the law enforcement side, but they have to have that knowledge. They have to have the understanding of what law enforcement is doing, some knowledge of those laws, some knowledge of what's right, what's wrong, because they can't be put in a position of saying or doing or not contacting law enforcement in the wrong times. Have to have that same knowledge. And again, the same thing on the other side. We don't want law enforcement personnel doing the social services and doing all those pieces, but they have to have that knowledge of it, have to have a knowledge of what's available, what it means, and how to address someone, and actually know when to call in our resources for that. So we need to make sure our law enforcement has the resources, means to get the mental health, the social services for the community, for the members of the community. Okay. Any questions so far? I'm sorry if I'm rushing through this a little bit. I know it's been a very long day and I'm trying to make sure everybody gets a lot of information, but also gets a lot of pieces to take out of here. Okay. Identifying, determining the need. You need to first identify the community violence and issues that you have there. You can't decide to have a team, you can't decide to have a community effort without knowing what you have to address. What kind of crimes do you have? What kinds of issues do you have in the community? Who are your victims? Your primary and secondary. And I mean by that is primary is the person who has been shot or has been attacked or had been robbed. Secondary is the community who is being affected by it. So if you had an arson case, a little simpler way to see it, the church, community church gets burnt down. Your primary victim is the church, the people who actually own the building, who ever paid the rent. But then your secondary as well are your parishioners, because they put money towards the church. They put money towards going there. It's also their house of worship. Then you also may have a daycare center that's part of there. Then also, because the church is gone, some of your secondary piece and victims might be the building next door, where it might have been a grocery store, might have been the restaurant, may have catered to the church. So those are some of the means of looking at your whole picture of who is being affected by this crime, by what's going on in your community. What are the needs of your community? What are they looking for? Where is the gaps? What's missing there? Where do you have to get some additional resources? Those are some things that need to be looked at. And cause and effect. What started where? Which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing, but what crimes are going on? What's the cause and effect? What are these crimes? What are these issues causing and doing to the community? So as we talk about evaluate your community as well, when you're looking at thinking about who should be part of your team and who should be part of doing the work, you need to evaluate the demographics, the population. What are the languages? You know, what's the primary languages being spoken in your community? You know, if you're looking at a community that's predominantly Spanish speaking, you don't want to have only service providers who do not speak Spanish. You need to make sure that you have that means and ability, enough translators, enough people to work with whoever is going to be communicating with the community people. The age ranges. Do you have a lot of youth? Do you have a lot of elderly? You want to know that, because that's going to be different resources you're going to need. Culture. What's the ethnic makeup? That makes a big difference too. The LGBTQ community, what is going on there? Is that, or is it hidden? Is it people needing to have resources? Are there no resources? And they have a large community for this. Religious affiliations, houses of worship. How much are they involved? Do you have that any houses of worship in the community? And how are they involved or not involved? And sometimes that can be your main base of pulling people in, because we do realize that the houses of worship do bring in a lot of the community members, especially the elderly, especially the families. And a lot of times in a lot of ethnic groups, that brings in a lot of resources for people as well. The economic breakdown. Do you have a middle, lower, upper finances? Where do you have that? Do you have a mixture? Sometimes that can make some differences too, because that can also affect some things like the unemployment levels or the employment levels, the education levels, the mobility means. Do people have a means to private transportation? Do they only use public transportation? This is important when you're figuring out to have community events. Are you going to have events that are way away from public transportation? You can have them near that. Do you have to find places where people can find parking? Those are some of the things you need to look at, types of crime and frequency. And I say this over again because it's important. It plays a role in every single piece of this. The types of crime is also going to be different in each community. One of the things I learned when I came to ATF, I've worked in various cities, as I said, and every city and every state has its own predominant crime. Working for ATF, I was working nationally and internationally with crimes in different communities. And I saw the difference of every single city, every single state, what was their predominant crimes. We had one state that had a high increase of carjackings, where another state we had the high increase of arson cases, and so on. So each state, each community has their type, quote unquote, type of crime, type of situations going on there. And you need to understand that when you're establishing your team. Establish the team to identify existing resources and gaps in community, as I said. Identify roles and responsibilities. People need to know what their role is. We don't want to overlap, but you need to know what your responsibilities are as opposed to the person sitting next to you. And that goes for each law enforcement personnel and each social service personnel. We need to know what the roles are, what the responsibilities are in creating and establishing this team and moving forward in the community, and how each person is going to, each group, each person, each agency is going to work towards developing a positive community and work towards lowering and understanding and addressing witness intimidation in their communities. Have similar core values. This is important. We can't have people in the team who are going to be coming from the left perspective when you're having everybody that's going to the right perspective, and vice versa. And not even talking political perspectives there, I'm talking about just directions, that basically everyone has to be the same course, the same plane, the same area. Multidisciplinary planning committee. This is important. You don't want to have only one thought process. You need, as I said, you have the law enforcement, the social services. They have different perspectives, they have different needs, responsibilities, and they see things a little differently. So you need to have both of those put there. Identify everybody's roles and responsibilities, as I said. Develop victim assistance support protocols. This is essential. Without this, you're going to have a vacant piece of your work. You're going to not be able to address the needs of your witness intimidation and the people in the community. You're still going to be stuck with a place where no one's going to come forward, because people are not going to feel that they're going to be supported. They're not going to feel like they're going to be safe. They're not going to feel like they can make a difference. Communication and referral protocol. This is important because of the fact that everybody needs to know who to go to for what resources. And everybody needs to be talking to each other. Not one person, not one group, not one agency can hold all of the pieces to themselves and basically hold on to all that information. It has to be shared, has to be basically put out to everybody else. Funding, assistance, procedures, and disbursement. What that means is any kind of fundings that might be available for the community, for witness intimidation, for housings, for food, or anything else. It needs to be talked about and everybody understanding how it's going to be used. And I do recommend, in a lot of programs, a lot of communities do develop the MOUs, MOAs. This keeps everybody on the same track and the same course. And I know in PSN, a lot of communities do have this. I do have resources of that, and I know if people have questions with that, they can reach out to me afterwards, and I can get you some information on that as well. And these are just some list of potential partners, and it can go on for a lot more. But, you know, looking at the local, state, tribal communities, law enforcement, child welfare systems, juvenile justice systems, of course, child advocacy systems, all of those pieces need to be involved. Rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters. This is a safe haven for a lot of people, and they need to be part of the program here as well, and part of your team. Civil legal services, you know, we need to make sure that attorneys are available for both sides. You know, you have to make sure that even though the perpetrators are there and they're doing the violence, we have to make sure that there is some course that you can make some rehabilitation. We don't want to just say we're going to discard someone or something, or any community or any member of the community. That's going to be part of it. Immigrant services and immigration services, that is important, because you're going to have those people, especially if you have a lot of people in your community from other regions, other areas. And if you have non-documented workers there, non-documented people, you need to make sure that they're going to feel safe, that they can come out and talk to you. And that's another place where people aren't going to feel safe with that. Of course, the court process, human trafficking services, hospitals and urgent cares, and schools. Things in the schools, counselors and teachers can be very, very important for working with you. A lot of these local community programs, you know, the Kiwanis clubs and faith-based organizations, as I said, and any of the business leaders need to be involved, because they need to feel they're going to be respected as well, and they're going to be supported. So what we've been talking about is community work and basically working with community violence and intimidation. So what's important to understand is all of your vulnerable witnesses, and that's why they're not coming forward. So who are they? Your vulnerable witnesses are just about everyone in your community. We talked about victims of domestic violence. We talked about human trafficking victims, illegal immigrants. We're talking about victims of any kind of crime, people who are living in households with a perpetrator, witnesses residing in the same neighborhoods. Those are your witnesses, but these are also your potentially vulnerable witnesses as well. So what happens is you have a witness, vulnerable witness, a witness at all, they're intimidated, they now become your victim. It just funnels right down. This is your victim. And now you're needing to deal with that witness as a victim. You know, you might need that witness to be part of your case. You might need them to be part of making a change in your community. But now they are your victim, and they need to actually be able to get those services. And now you need to respond to them as that. And what that means is giving them some other kinds of resources, not just taking a testimony, not just taking down their information of what they heard, what they saw, but now you need to make sure that you're identifying them as victims and that you're going to address their needs as victims. That means predominantly keeping them safe. That means also looking at the community to make sure that they feel comfortable either in that community or someplace else, making sure that the families of the homicide victims have justice, but also that they have a voice, that they actually get told what's going on. And children are the highest number, the easiest to feel intimidated, threatened. They are the ones who are going to feel that they can't come forward, but they're also going to want to feel the most trauma from the crimes, from the situations. They're going to be the ones who are going to be pulled into gang activities, as well as feeling like they can't say no. They're going to be the ones who are going to be treated as second and ignored, while they're going to be giving you the most information and they're going to be the most traumatized. And they're the ones who need sometimes the most care and understanding from the community, from the workers, from law enforcement, from victim services. We can't ignore them. We have to address it. So one of the things also is that we have a lot of times we're talking a lot about domestic violence victims. One of our other predominantly potential threatened and high level victims that we see, and I saw a lot here at ATF, was domestic violence victims. While a domestic violence victim is not, quote unquote, a federal victim because of domestic violence, what we have a lot, and we've seen a lot, is a lot of our domestic violence victims who came forward and provided testimony on their perpetrator in regard to federal crimes, federal cases. And at one time, I had a case where a domestic violence victim provided testimony to one of our law enforcement officers, to one of our agents, in regard to her perpetrator having and being involved in gun trafficking. The abuser then learned through other means that this particular victim was the one who turned him in and provided information to law enforcement. The biggest issue was that he then also learned that this victim was the one who is now on the run. What happens is that we see that he had a close relationship, of course. He knew the power and control of how to threaten, how to control her, how to make sure that she was undermined him. He also had the knowledge of her support systems. And this is what we see a lot in domestic violence cases. This victim now became our witness, now became, again, our victim now because of the fact of the intimidation and the threats. Unfortunately, in this particular case, what happened was that our law enforcement officers did not notify and involve our victim service program. What happened was that, as we see many times, a domestic violence victim is going to go to their resources and their old resources. And that's what happened here. And she went back home to her mother's home in another state. The perpetrator, the abuser, knew this where the mother lived and followed her right there, and then captured her, beat her, raped her, and threw out of the car. At this point, victim services was now involved. Unfortunately, she had to be harmed, but we took care of making sure she was not harmed again, and we made sure that she kept safe. This is one of the resources that we need to make sure we bring in victim services and assistance in the very beginning. Don't wait until there's more danger, there's more threats, there's more endangerment of anyone's life or safety. One of the other things we see a lot at ATF, we saw a lot of domestic violence victims who were threatened when their abuser was put in jail, again, for federal crimes of gun trafficking and drug trafficking, but from jail. We had several cases where the abuser was setting up a murder for hire contract against their domestic violence victim. Again, we could talk about the fact that they knew their intimate relationship, they knew all their support systems, they knew their schedule, they knew all of those things. So they were able to set up those contracts. Be aware that when your victims have an intimate relationship with the abuser, with the criminal, there are more potentials for them to be threatened, intimidated, and being killed or harmed. So you need to be aware of those pieces as well. Any questions so far? Okay. So one of the final steps after threats and intimidation is retaliation. I talked about that today too. Why do abusers, why do criminals do retaliation? One of the biggest pieces is it's the final. It is the final step in intimidation. It is. It's the final piece of control of abuse. It is the award. It's the power driven. It is the attention. It's the statement. It is the final piece. What it also is for the criminals to say to other people in the community, to other potential witnesses, you see what I did, you don't want to be that. And it's actually their place that they can say and show that they mean it. So this is where we want to make sure we keep from getting to the retaliation, to the final step, to that place where they're going to be the making their final award statements in the final piece. So trauma-informed care, its approaches, basically, we talked about that a lot today as well. And it's important to remember that when you're dealing with your victims, you're dealing with your witnesses, this is essential to know how to make sure they stay safe, how to make sure they're giving them trust. They need to trust you as law enforcement, as the people coming in there. You need to make sure we have resources, again, victim supporting counseling. And again, no one agency can do all this on their own. No one person can do this on their own. So we need to make sure we're working in the full community to make sure people are staying safe. When we're talking about crime victims, it is critical that we talk about the fact that victims experience a variety of physical, psychological, and social needs, such as to be classified under the 7 critical needs of a crime victim: safety, support, information, access, continuity, voice, and justice. These are the things that every victim, every witness needs to have. It is essential that we provide this because of the fact that we need to make sure that they're receiving the safety and protection from their perpetrators, the assistance in avoiding retaliation, re-victimization. We need to make sure that they have assistance and support to make sure that they're going to be able to participate in the criminal justice process. They need to make sure they have information of the criminal justice process and their victims' rights. Every state has a victims' rights process, and the federal law enforcement has the victims' rights as well. Federal has different rights and responsibilities than some states, so we actually should be working together with that. Access to and ability to participate in the justice system. They need to be able to do that. And you're going to have to provide those means, sometimes even driving them, sometimes giving them, money for a cab or refunds or whatever, resources for that. Continuity. It is important that they have consistency through everything that goes on. They have to make sure that when you say to them, they're going to have, that lollipop when this is done, you have to do that. When you say to them, they're going to get that money for the taxi, it has to be done, but it has to be done each time. You can't just tell somebody you get it one time and then take it back again. You have to have the consistency, but also the consistency in giving them services. Also the consistency in being there. We have to be there. You can't show up today and not be there tomorrow. We have to be there the whole time. The voice, they have to be able to speak out and provide their voice and give them that opportunity to have a voice in the process, in the criminal justice process. And again, justice. And justice means something different to a lot of people. And sometimes people think that by going to justice process, they're going to feel together, they're going to feel whole, and everything's going to feel better for them. That doesn't always work that way. We know that. So we need to make sure that people are getting that kind of support and information. So one of the things I want to talk a little about is actually some kind of case examples. I'm sorry, I went too far back. Oops. Case example. Sorry about that. One of the things is that we have a lot of times, sometimes our victims and our intimidated witnesses are not always going to be the non-criminal. So a lot of times our witnesses, our victims are sometimes victims or criminals themselves in other cases, in other situations, in other kinds of means. So I had a particular case where I had members of two rival gangs, and two of these, actually three gentlemen who were under the age of 18 were kidnapped, tortured. Two of them were forced to watch the third member of their gang being shot and killed in front of them. The other two members were actually brutally beaten, sodomized, and by the point where they were actually placed in the hospital. This particular case, the victims in this case had a criminal background, had a criminal history, but they were not potentially criminals in that particular case. They were the victims in this case. They were not actually responsible for what happened to them. They didn't do anything to do that other than being part of another gang. In this particular case, our agents were able to interview these victims in the hospital, and we actually met with them, figured out what they needed. These victims were traumatized, of course, not only watching their friend being killed in front of them, but also themselves being beaten, tortured, and sodomized, and they had to now talk to police. They did not want to, they were not comfortable. Of course, they had their own histories of dealing with law enforcement. What happened was that in this particular case, the law enforcement officers, our agents, contacted the victim services, and we were able to work with these victims directly. We actually met with them. We actually provided them some resources. We also were able to get them into counseling and pay for the counseling for these young gentlemen. That helped with their trauma. What that aided them to do is to be able to go to court and testify. Without that, they never would have been able to go to court. They never would have felt whole to be able to do that. At the end of the trial, one of the mothers came up to our officers and said, one of our agents, and said that they thanked us for providing the counseling and providing the support services. And what this mother said was that it showed her son that law enforcement gave a damn about him and not just the case. We cared about him, we cared about the case, we cared about both, but we knew that this was not going to happen and this case was not going to go forward unless these victims were able to feel whole and feel that they could feel safe to go forward and to be able to testify and to feel that they could trust law enforcement to help them with this. So one of the things is that victim services can help with relocation, financial assistance, victims crime compensation. And every state has some type of victims crime victims compensation, but every state has its own guidelines. So I know a lot of you are working in different states and internationally. So some of these things may or may not be available. You have to see what's going on in your own community. Civil legal assistance, we've been helping with that. Substance abuse treatment, counseling services, job referrals. Restraining orders are very important. And relocation, we work a lot with relocation and helping to relocate our victims, our witnesses, sometimes out of state. When you have to do that, we can provide a lot of short-term hotels, family sometimes send them to substance abuse treatment facilities. We've had to use that, and it's helped an awful lot. And keeping persons safe that way, as well as getting them to a place where they could testify and they could provide information. One of the other things is long-term permanent relocation. Section 8, I know most times in most states you have to work with the prosecutor's office, as we have to do with the federal. And these are hard to get, HUD Section 8 transfers. But once you do, it really helps a lot and people feel a bit safer. The Marshals Program, again, working with the federal, working with the prosecutor's office, that is something as a permanent, but always be careful, be very wary about that, because if someone has a child from another person who's not living with them at the time and they're not being, moved with them, then they're not going to be able to basically stay away, not be able to see that child again. When relocating, determine the gang affiliation in the area that you're going to move them to. If you're talking about a gang affiliation that's going to still be there, it's not going to be a safe place. If you can, one, vet the hotels, but also try and use fictitious names, try and have a third party book and pay for it. Don't repeatedly use the same hotels. It's really important because the hotels get used to, the staff gets used to you sending them people there. They're going to start sending out information. And what happens is the criminals know that they're going to be there, so they start watching those hotels. Have witness sign security and property agreement with you, not just with the hotel, but with you. We call it the relocation agreement. Basically, they would be put down what they're responsible for, that they know that they're responsible for anything over and above their hotel room, any kind of, room services, or, they destroy things. But also if they start going on social media and start telling people where they are and start showing pictures of where they are, we need to make sure that they have that information, that they know that putting themselves at risk, and we cannot be responsible for that. When you bring people there to the hotels, don't wear uniforms, don't show badges, those kinds of things, of course. And further away, the better, of course. And when relocation is not an option, sometimes it's not feasible, too many people, not funds, whatever, or the person just doesn't want to. Things like home security systems, new locks and cameras and alarm systems can be helpful. Addition police patrol, that's when you want to have them outside, of course. Have witnesses alter their daily routines. We know that we don't want them in the same place, the same location, the same routine every day. We talked about that earlier. Heard some of our speakers talk about that. You're putting yourself in a means of basically being in violence and basically not having your safety because people know where you are and where you're going. Basically also educate your witness, educate your victim in things regarding safety planning. Make sure that they have their papers and things all set up. Make sure that they have a suitcase there. Make sure they know what to say, how to call police, how to call law enforcement of any kind to get and report anything. Make sure that they have pressure and evidence to have attempted contacts. So like pictures, or say, get some descriptions. Show them how and why they need to delete their social medias and their GPS on their phones. People can track them. They put on their social media, people can track you through that. Make sure you explain that to them and show them how to and why it's important. Tell them how to log attempts by the defendant to contact them on their phones, on their media. We know when people start making phone calls and start saying who they are and not even knowing who they are, and we start letting people know that that's their phone, that's their new phone numbers. Use things like disposable phones. Sometimes it helps a lot to get rid of them having social media and having that connection with those numbers. How to communicate with law enforcement, as I said, and basically judicial process and major events. Make sure that people understand, your victims and witnesses know what the next event, what the next pieces of the judicial process are going to be. More information the better they are. More information is empowerment, and have more knowledge it's much better for them to feel that they're going to feel safe. And they're going to know that you're giving them that information. They don't have to worry about somebody coming and telling them things that's not real. Emergency victim funds, of course, can be available in some federal resources. Again, if you're working with a federal agency, a lot of the agencies like ATF, FBI, DEA have emergency funds that you can work with. U.S. Attorney's Office Emergency Witness Assistance Program, again, they call it EWAP. Basically, that's through the U.S. Attorney's Office. They have federal funds for witness protection, for federal crimes, for federal witnesses. And as I said before, state victims compensation. Every state has one, and it works with both state and federal crimes. They provide funds and assistance to both state and federal victims, but you need to know what they do allow and they don't allow. And all of them have a website, so you can go on there and see what they do allow, and everyone is different. It's basically decided by a committee in each state. In summary, I want to make sure we understand that one of the first things you need to do with regard to witness intimidation and protection is being proactive, not reactive. Understanding that this is going on, seeing it, knowing it, and trying to respond to it to start. Public safety efforts, bringing out information, talking to your community, making the efforts beforehand, and actually trying to set up to get the support and respect as well as trust of the community. Having victim services set up, having them available, knowing what you have in your community, knowing where your gaps are and where you may need to reach outside. Offender accountability. This is important when we're talking about witness intimidation. You need to know where the offenders are, who's doing what, and making sure community as well as offenders know that they're going to be held accountable to what's going on there. And a team effort. Bottom line, no one can do this alone. No agency can do it alone. It has to be a team effort, but you have to work together and on the same path in the same direction. So I think that is my conclusion for today. That is basically my context, but I'm open to any kinds of questions or any kinds of inquiries and responses. Please feel free to ask anything you may have. I got you done a little bit faster so that you can actually get to dinner earlier tonight.
Darling, we do have quite a few questions for you, so they might not get to dinner too early, but they'll get there early enough. One question is, do you know the sentence of those gang members who committed that crime? I'm referring to one of the case studies, I'm assuming. Do you know how the victims were doing after the case was closed? Did they remain in the gang?
No, they didn't actually. Once they basically, because of the resources that we provided them and the services that we did, the victims who were involved in that gang case actually did step away from the gang, and they actually did go on to do more positive work in their communities as well. So we have been involved with them for a long time. Thank you for asking that.
Awesome. Let's make our way through. We have about 7 or so. We're going to see if we can get through all of them. Outside of the U.S. Marshal WIT SEC program, what other types of programs does the federal government have that can help assure safety?
The federal government, if the case has a federal involvement, then each federal agency can actually work with those victims and witnesses. So I can speak for ATF because, as you know, I just recently retired from there. Actually, it's only 2 weeks, so it's very recent. So what it is we are working a case, ATF is working a case with the state, local law enforcement, and we're doing some investigations. We can help provide some funds for housing, for moving them in relocation, for foods, things of that nature, as well as utilizing the counseling services, the crisis intervention services from each of those agencies. So each agency has some sort of emergency victim funds. And as I said before, our intimidated witnesses become our victims.
Moving along, someone asked if indirect intimidation or threats could be witness tampering.
It is. And indirect, as long as anything that's stopping someone from testifying or providing information to law enforcement, that is witness tampering.
All right, let's see. Okay, here we go. I wonder what you would have to say about supporting victims and witnesses that live in a very small and very isolated community with no systems of support. Then we got a question about this a lot today. I'm just providing services to victims and survivors from rural communities.
Rural communities are quite interesting. And actually, it's interesting you're asking that, because back in my time, The reason I was able to retire from ATF is I've been in government. I did my 20 years in government, and prior to coming to ATF, I was working with the Office of Violence Against Women, and I was working rural communities, grant services, and domestic violence and rape programs. And one of the things there we saw is that every community had something, but it wasn't next door. It wasn't in their backyard. So reaching out to those other communities really helped a lot in working with those services. But in regard to police forces and so on, I know that a lot of times there's police forces that are smaller because of the size of the community, but they were able to work with some other kinds of police forces, law enforcement next door to them. But also, again, almost every federal agency has something working in those areas. So even though, as again, I'll say about ATF, even though we may not have a particular office sitting right in your backyard, it is a part of that community and it covers those areas. So they still would be responding to you. And I will be honest with you, what I've seen here is that those small areas where we have a high prevalence of crime, a high prevalence of witness intimidation, especially, we do have offices down there. So I know that sometimes you can reach out to them. If a federal agency is not assisting in a case or is not working a case, even if they're not, they can provide you some resources there as well. So, and I can tap into, if you want to send me some places that you have, I can help find some resources there as well.
Awesome. Well, looks like that will wrap things up for today. Everyone has Darlene's email address. And if you're looking for additional support, you guys can always email us at psntta.org as well. We want to thank all of our presenters for today. We want to thank our Project Safe Neighborhoods TTA team. And we are hoping that this was a lot of really good information that you can use in your organizations and in your agencies. Just a couple of more announcements before we wrap things up today. For those who have not already registered, please make sure you do so using the link that I shared via our chat. That way you can get all of our follow-up emails and follow-up information and resources. And I think that's good. And we have an evaluation that you will be prompted to complete when you click the leave button for the Zoom webinar. And we, again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been long, but awesome presenters, wonderful experience and expertise. And we look forward to seeing you all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate all your time. Good luck.